Welcome to the Producer Profile segment of the show. In this episode, I talk to Nicole Rolet, the co-owner of Chêne Bleu. Blessed with coverage of national factor, Chêne Bleu has the benefit of an exceptional location, multifaceted geology, and a southern Rhône climate with soil typical of the northern Rhône. Isolated and protected, high in the mountain saddle, Chêne Bleu has its provenance in a unique four-corner borderland of the department of Gigondas, Cotes du Ventoux, Côtes du Rhône, and Séguret. In this conversation, we explore how Chêne Bleu has achieved its success, from the business decisions of working with world-class consultants and taking a long-term vision. Nicole speaks about the first years at Chêne Bleu and their values. This episode is a true insight into the operational and philosophical objective of Chêne Bleu. Hi, I'm Mattia Scarpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Welcome to the Looking Into Wine podcast. I'm Mattia Scarpazza, your host. Today's guest is the owner of one of the most foremost wineries in the southern Rhône, which is making an impact globally with wines that are made largely outside the French appellation system, but based on the Rhône grape varieties. The estate in question is Chêne Bleu, which sits among the peaks of Dentelles de Montmiral in the foothills of the Mont Ventoux. I give a warm welcome to Nicole Rolet, principal of Chêne Bleu.
Hello, Mattia. So nice to be with you today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here with you in your house and here in London. It's been a long time. I haven't had any live interview, so it feels great. So I wanted to start by asking what inspired Chêne Bleu? What was the inspiration behind it?
So it really started with my husband unearthing this really strange little property abandoned by everyone way at the top of a mountain in its own little mountain saddle. You go of this winding road for 10 minutes before you see another house, let alone a vineyard, in the middle of the woods. It wasn't even paved when we got it. So you really had to have the kind of personality that enjoyed venturing off the beaten path and discovering these hidden gems. So right away, that location set the tone for a very unusual approach to making fine wine in the middle of nowhere. So I think Chêne Bleu, from the metaphor, you know that Chêne Bleu means blue oak, and there was a tree that we painted with copper sulfide, which we thought was a beautiful metaphor for protecting and preserving the history of the place, the beauty. Right away, I think there was a notion that it was its own separate little planet, planet Chêne Bleu. From the beginning, we had the mindset to do something that was a little bit different and personal.
That's very much the story of Chêne Bleu, what you do in your wine. So you, as I said at the beginning, you decided to step out of the AOC system. You're doing your own way, which is make it very interesting and very compelling to discover those wines. And just to clarify, where are you based? Because I know it's very important for you and your wines and many of the decisions you made.
Absolutely, because if you look at a map of the Rhône, you'll see that it looks we're in the heart of the southern Rhône. It looks like we're smack in that Gigondas area. We're on top of 4 appellations, and in a 2-dimensional world, you get a completely incorrect expectation of what those wines will taste like, because you look at the neighboring appellations and we have some Ventoux, some Cotes du Rhône, some Gigondas, some Séguret, some Vin de Pays. But those appellations all call for beautiful concentration and texture and fruit. However, they don't tell the real story. The real story of our winery is the 3rd dimension, is the altitude. being able to make wine on the southern latitude, but so high up, 550 to 630 meters, that in fact, so many things change there, that is really why we have so much less in common with our neighbors than you would expect if you see on the map, and how much more we have in common with the northern Rhône, because the altitude is going to give us that freshness.
When I tried the wines before, that they have this freshness into it, which was very much something that I found in the Mont Ventoux. I think you are much more closer to the wines of the Mont Ventoux, at heart at least, style-wise.
Yes, I think that our area really puts its finger on the idiosyncrasies and intellectual fallacies around how the appellation system was drawn up in our part of the world. And I think it has a lot of merit from many points of view, administrative, etc. However, if you're going to do appellation, you should do it right. And you have to take into consideration the altitude when you're trying to define a climate, a microclimate, etc. And so it makes more sense in Burgundy, for example, if you have the climat and you have the top of the hill that has one thing, and or even Napa, you have mountain fruit, valley fruit. Yeah. But the fact that Gigondas goes from 250 meters to 550 meters and is all called one appellation, when half the guys have snow at the same time as the other ones have rain, or half are harvesting in October while the others are harvesting in September or August, like by definition, there's something that doesn't make sense. So we decided to take a bird's eye view on that, step back, deconstruct our terroir, and rebuild it around the logic of the geology and the climate rather than these very arbitrary lines. Yeah. So philosophically, I do feel very close to Ventoux. And that's because there's a great turnaround story happening there. And all these little micro terroirs that were kind of poo-pooed by some of the more famous appellations are actually coming to the front with some very exciting producers, a lot of freedom of expression, a lot of experimentation, and less of that oppressive mindset that you have to be in the pursuit of typicity, right? So in French, you say la typicité, right? Yeah. And the appellation system often rewards that. But where we are, in the Ventoux, I think you have a premium on la typicité L', atypical, Yeah. And so that's really fun because you attract more the artists and less the artisans. And so I think the environment is feeding on itself and creating a dynamic and an excitement that I find hard to find in some of the very traditional appellations. And God forbid, I love Châteauneuf, I love Gigondas. I have nothing against those really traditional areas. And I think some of the work they do and the know-how is very inspirational. But I don't think it reflects the vibe in the Ventoux, which is more iconoclastic.
It's more vibrant. And how was when you just arrived there? What was the sort of feedback you got from the neighbors in France? It must have been very difficult, conservative country.
Well, they did think that some aliens had landed in their vineyards. They were quite worried because the construction and the turnaround of both the priory and the vineyard took so long. 12 years just to turn around the vineyard. Same thing for the house. So forever they saw construction there, and they had all these questions about these new neighbors. And so, of course, little villages, they have a lot of imagination. Yeah. The rumors were going in every direction about who we were and why we were there. And I'm very happy to say that 10 years into it, when people started coming to visit, they started slowly understanding all of that was really very far away from the truth. We were just very, very passionate about this very specific little micro terroir, and we were doing all this stuff to support it. And I think now, 20 years into it, a lot of that has fallen to the wayside. I think there's an understanding that we don't make a lot of wine. We're not going to hurt them in any way with their sales. On the other hand, we do have a showcase for what these special little micro terroirs can do. And it's a very inclusive place, not just for clients and, people who work there, but also for other winemakers. And we love having those exchanges, and we all learn so much from each other. So I think they understand that we're really more part of the solution than part of the problem. But the first years were quite crazy, especially as an American woman showing up there with lots of energy and full of ideas, like a Tasmanian devil kind of around the vineyard. They were a little bit scared about that.
See, I was reading, and you, from the get-go, you had some great people helping you out, a great consultant. How did sort of helped, do you think?
Well, it's very hard to get the attention of those consultants, because it's a little bit like going into the acting world, for example. Everybody wants Meryl Streep's agent and coach to get started in the profession. But with the top people, you have to really earn your stripes and also be lucky, right? You can never cold call these people. I couldn't just call Claude Denis de Bourguignon, for example, and say, please, can we work with you? I mean, they won't even answer the email. They get solicitations from all over the world. Same with people like Philippe Camby or Zamalong. And so we did get a few lucky breaks. I find Michel Béthane, who's one of my heroes, he really it was a funny story, because we met through Louis-Philippe Latour, the amazing people that invited us to, early on to one of their tastings. I mean, so nice. And the surprise was that when I started talking to him, they connected us. And when we started talking, he was very dismissive, because, all the time people are saying, I have a new vineyard, I have a new project, whatever. And he was polite, but you could see he wasn't really interested per se, because why would he be? And then at one point, I think I mentioned Zamalong, and his body language totally changed, because she's just such an icon. Anybody who's behind the scenes in wine comes to know and love this incredible woman who has done so much for the wine world, for women in the wine world. I mean, she's been such an innovator, disruptor, everything. She's just always ahead of the curve. And suddenly he was like, what is Zelma Long doing out in the mountains in the Vaucluse making wine? Where there's smoke, there must be fire. And so things like that, that gave us the benefit of the doubt with him. So then he came and saw early on what we were doing and really understood who we were and what this was about. And then he recommended us to Claude Denis de Bourguignon. So it's always that kind of, it's always a very difficult thing, I think, to get the right people to work with from the start. Yeah. And, we made mistakes as well. Of course, I won't make any names, but we did waste a fair amount of time with certain people who were not really understanding the caliber of the seriousness of the project.
Investing in the good people at the beginning pays off in the long term, which it does now with the quality of your wines and the everything behind it. It shows. And I mean, obviously, you was talking about how the appellation wasn't working, and you were nominated the first Super Rhône. How does that feel for you, and how did it make you feel?
Well, I've always been appellation agnostic. I'm not an anti-appellation person. I didn't personally have a bad experience like Trévalon or something with the famous stories where they all ganged up on him and his only choice was to leave the appellation, so he decided to, it wasn't that kind of antagonistic thing at all. It was just pragmatic to say, okay, I have these grapes and these grapes that really should go together. Where our team was really working closely, because it was my husband, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and me really consulting each other on all the decisions and saying, wait a minute, let's try these things. We really need to blend these, and our only choice is to either we lie and cheat and we do some trickery about whatever, or this doesn't make sense. We're not going to make as good a wine if we follow the appellations. So it wasn't really from a position of wanting to teach anybody a lesson or anything like that. But I realize in hindsight how maybe naive / courageous it was to take on all the difficulties that we already had and also step out of the appellation. It was really like being on our own and more like the people who try to row across the Atlantic, in a rowboat by themselves. It's not for the faint of heart.
Deciding to go out of the appellation probably managed to make you get some press release and these sort of things, which work out in the end. I'm sure you're very successful in all your sales globally. And I know also that you work a lot with Grenache. You're a big fan of Grenache, so am I. You led the Grenache Symposium. And I wanted to ask, how does Grenache at altitude differs from I would say the valley floor or any other area, because it's not so common to find high altitude Grenache.
I'm so happy you talk about that, because I think consumers are so confused about Grenache because they try to find a very common denominator. And Grenache, like Pinot, is one of those grapes that adapts so much and reflects so much the terroir and the people who make it and how they make it. So in finance, I would say it has a high beta. There's a big difference in the terms of the style. So high altitude for us is really our vineyard is at the absolute limit of where Grenache will grow in altitude and latitude, right? So it's an extreme fringe manifestation of Grenache. So a lot of Grenache that's more commonly associated with that word is the softer, more gentle, the velvety, voluptuous mouthfeel that gives that sort of friendliness to a blend. It's a team player that is a little bit bland in terms of personality compared to some of the alpha grapes, but always gets along with everyone. And so it's unusual to find a Grenache that can really hold its own center stage as the main actor, what's the word when in Hollywood, the lead actor or whatever. And the advantage of altitude, where we are at least, is that first of all, it gets concentrated because the south of France has a lot of winds, right? 21 different names for winds, a bit like Eskimos with their names for snow and all that. And so the berries dry out quite a bit and they get very naturally sticky texture, which I think is not always associated with Grenache. It has a nice soft texture, but it's a bit translucent sometimes. Okay. And this really concentrates it. The second thing is that the skins, to survive at altitude in these very difficult mineral environments, they get very thick and packed with phenolics. And the roots, of course, on Grenache, they have those famous power roots, right? That makes them the eco superstars, right? Because they survive all sorts of extreme weather. They're very well suited for climate change, all of that. Just the plants themselves. You can argue that the grapes, because they like alcohol, they make alcohol quite readily, might not do well in a typical hot environment. But at altitude, it's cooler. Yeah. And the power roots can go down to these subterranean water tables that in the mountains are sometimes, like where we are, 300 feet below ground. Oh. So many vines struggle to make it through that topsoil when it's so sparse. But the Grenache is really great. So you can get really thick old vines up there that are so sturdy and hearty that I think really contribute to making kind of masculine, muscular, concentrated style with a lot of spice, not all that beautiful fruit that we like about Grenache, but many more nuances and layers of aromatics.
The richness. And what other grapes do you have planted at the moment, and how does it work for your blends, the Grenache?
Well, the vineyard came with this old vine, Grenache and Syrah, and that was priceless because obviously a new winery being able to have the luxury of starting with old vines, that I think really helped us from the get-go to put our foot down and say, no, we want to make complex, age-worthy wines, not cheap and cheery imitations of a Côtes du Rhône, which is a cheap and cheery imitation of a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, in the popular belief system. And so, the other grapes that we have were the white. So the whites, nobody wanted us to plant whites. We had that idea, wait a minute, maybe with the altitude, this would be good. And every consultant, not Zelma and Philippe, because we didn't know them yet, but all the people we started with were saying, no, you're too far south. Don't do white grapes. You're not going to be happy here. And my husband was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense at all because of the altitude, the soils, all of that. And the only person who supported us at the beginning for that decision was Christian Veu, who was for a long time the director at Château Lanert, but before that he was at Montredon. They make fabulous whites. And he was like, oh no, this would be a great terroir for whites. I'd give my right hand to make whites up here. So we decided to defy all the logic of the local advisors and put in the whites. And so that was great. So we have obviously Grenache Blanc, Marsanne, Roussanne. We've have Viognier, which we do a separate one. We have some Vermentino, which we call Rolle. We've planted some Clairette. So great place for whites. And we have some new parcelles coming up, which we'll be dedicating to whites as well. And because it's completely not even in Vin de Pays, but like in Vin de France, we're even thinking of trying some very crazy indigenous grapes that, would be very exciting to have there.
Being out all the way out.
If you're out, if it's a bit like Aikido, you have to take your greatest weakness and make it into your strength,
I
right?
can see that all the way through your wines and everything, talking to you now. And I was going to ask when you were talking about the Vermentino, the role that plays a quite important role for one of your reds. How is it quite new? How does it work?
Yes, it's similar to that because, and I didn't mention for the reds that we also had, we have this fantastic Mourvèdre that nobody wanted us to plant. But back to your question, we ended up blending some of the Viognier into our Héloïse because that's the Syrah blend with a bit of Grenache. And we were trying this paint by numbers thing where since our Syrah was very much mountain Syrah, very northern Rhône style, we thought, okay, well, in the northern Rhône, they softened their austere, elegant Syrah with some Viognier. Why don't we try that? And we really liked the perfume on our Viognier. We liked the fact that it had really elegant restraint. So we decided to put some of that in. And that was fine. It was really good. I liked those first vintages a lot because the nose was so pretty. Yeah. But as the project developed and we were really wanting to accentuate the difference between Abelard and Héloïse, we were playing around and my brother-in-law Jean-Louis was like, well, what about putting some Roussanne because it would accentuate the kind of voluptuous mouthfeel because the Roussanne doesn't just have pretty aromatics, it also would soften a bit the texture and the tannins on the Syrah and really make it even more of a female, figure. And so that I was actually didn't think that was a good idea until I tried it. And then I really liked it. I was like, no, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And then, if nothing else on a project like ours, you never want to lose that experimental thing. You never want to fall back on, play your greatest hits because that's what, you always want to keep an experimental aspect to your work, and it keeps you fresh and it keeps people understanding that whatever they're going to get from Chêne Bleu, it's going to be tradition with a twist. We're very respectful of all the history and all the know-how that's already in the wineverse, but we are always going to keep pushing the boundaries, trying new things, integrating new voices, very inclusive project. I mean, I know everybody talks about inclusivity, but I like to think that from the get-go, we've had social inclusivity, we've had, everything. At our winery, you'd think you're at the United Nations in terms of the breadth of people who work there and the different belief systems they have. We've had pretty much every single religion, gender, whatever you name it.
I mean,
right?
I think because some have as your ethos the inclusivity and the experimental. I also think there is a sort of like holistic view, because also when how you see your project and your business, how it takes years to build it, and I can see the experience you have, you and Xavier, your husband. I can see in the future, long-term vision rather than just here now what's happening. And I think that sort of pays off in the long term for sure. And also in this research and everything, I know you also work quite a lot in biodynamic in the vineyards. And how is that for Chêne Bleu? What is the biodynamic for Chêne Bleu?
For us, I'm not going to take undue credit. This was completely Xavier's vision and understanding about the importance and value of biodiversity at a time in the project or in the world when these were not known things. The importance was not really fully recognized. I think people were starting to talk about them, but 25 years ago, he was drawn to the place itself specifically because of this sustainable environment, because of the incredible opportunity to work in the heart of a UNESCO biosphere reserve, with not just the soils, but also the macro biology, with famously in the Ventoux, 1,400 species just of butterflies, wolves coming back. I mean, the place is unbelievable. I don't know if you are aware, because many people come to the Ventoux because of the famous mountain, the cyclists and all of that. There's the landscapes, the wines. But actually, as a biosphere, it has the unique characteristic that in a very concentrated area, you have fauna and flora that go all the way from desert to Arctic. We have Arctic foxes, for example. And so with that biodiversity in mind, the embarrassment of riches in and around the vineyard was foundational in terms of his attraction to the place. And he's always been a conservationist, and he's always been a nature boy. I was a city girl, and the only biodiversity I had was pigeons and rats and cockroaches in Central Park and all of that for growing up in Manhattan. So for me, that was a big journey, and it took me a good 10, 15 years to become really at home in my place in that environment. So to your question, right away, he was the one who said, no chemicals, let's immediately set this thing up a different way, blah, blah. And I remember that caused a lot of problems in terms of the winemaking, because a lot of the shortcuts that we could have taken to get the project, the wines out the door, etc. Obviously, when you're doing that full conversion and then you're gaining your certifications and all of that, we had a kind of frustrating experience with one of the biodynamic certifying agencies, because when you read Rudolf Steiner, and of course Xavier is the kind of guy who always reads all the source material and everything, like he never just goes with the trailer. He always reads the director's cut, right? And then he has this mind like a steel trap and remembers every little detail about everything forever. And so he really took on all this philosophy. And these certifying people come and they have a little clipboard and they basically just ticking boxes, and it completely goes against the whole philosophy of what biodynamics really is preaching, which is that you are going to ultimately be the best parent to this vineyard. It's not prescriptive. Biodynamics is teaching you all about how to be a great parent, and then having you decide what's right for your child, not some other person comes in and says, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done that? Right? Yeah. So that was hard. Organic is much more straightforward and has a lot of loopholes, which are dangerous. So if you want to say that you're organic, but you're not really prepared to do some of the hard, expensive, complicated things, that's not a comprehensive solution, in my opinion.
I've heard from other people about how biodynamic is sort of. That's why I ask what is it for you, because I know that each producer has his own set of rules. I had a discussion on one other the podcast about biodynamic and how this expert sees every different producer doing their own things, and they go in a million different ways. And for me, it's always interesting to understand how do you work and what is your philosophy?
You can always do more. You can always learn more. Sustainable, I think, is really important in other ways. I think if you care about the land and its protection and preservation, and this isn't like some gimmick that you do to put something on your back label. I mean, honestly, in the fine wine world, in the space that we operate in, at the prices that we operate in, it's not about trying to gain a few percentage points of sales on some supermarket shelf or whatever, right? It's not going to have a commercial impact of that nature. People expect you to be doing everything possible, leave no stone unturned, and be extremely thoughtful and careful. Because at the top end, in every field, you're only as good as the weakest link in the chain. Everything you do matters. Every technology you invest in, every person who answers the phone, it's the sum of the parts. And I find value in all those philosophies. And I've spent a lot of time looking at the differences between, regenerative and permaculture. And, it's great. They all have value. You can learn stuff everywhere. Mm-hmm. But in the end, you're best off creating an amalgamation of big and good ideas that allow you to figure out what's best for your plants.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before, because we start reaching the end of our time, I wanted to ask where your wines are available, obviously, to the listeners. Where are you distributed at the moment? Just a few tick questions.
In any countries in particular, or?
Nicole, thank you for these 40 minutes together, half an hour. I really wanted to see the philosophy and the thoughts behind your wines and what is the reasoning behind it. There's a lot of article out there's a lot of interest about your wines, and I thought I wanted to, as I have you here in person, I wanted to know more about the philosophy behind it.
Well, Mattia, from the minute that I met you, I was so impressed with your attention to detail, your ability, interest, willingness to go deeper into things and look at details and look at the why and all of that. And that is exactly what's happening here, is that we're sort of creating a community of people around the world who have that curiosity, who have that sort of insightful wish to go beyond, to question how things are, to try new things. And that's just such a fun group of people to be surrounded by. And for us, the privilege of taking on a property that's more than 1,000 years old and trying to figure out how to pay tribute to the people who built walls that are so thick that we can still live in them, and they're so cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And their work was so thoughtful and so high quality, and they didn't do it for the fame or the fortune. They did it because they thought that was the right way to do things, to build things to last. And because of that, we feel the privilege and the obligation to do things with that same mindset that hopefully 1,000 years from now, people will be appreciating how we did things and why we did it that way. And, that really has had a huge consequence on how we think and why we do those things. And I think that's why not just the wines, but the place itself is such a beacon for people who appreciate things that are, really genuinely truthful, beautiful, and natural.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time. Once again, today's guest was Nicole Rolet of Chêne Bleu in southern France. I do invite everybody to go and visit them. The estate is fantastic. It's beautiful. I only saw the picture one day. I'll definitely go around and come and see you, Nicole. But it's been a pleasure having you here today.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much, Mattia, for making the time.
In this episode, we spoke to Nicole Rolet of Chêne Bleu in southern Rhône. Remember to hit follow the podcast, and as always, if you found listening to this podcast valuable, please leave a review. You can reach us on Instagram on Looking Into Wine and Mattia Scarpazza on all other social medias. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate on mattiascarpazza.com. Music produced by Samuele Di Nardo, editing and mastering by Tommaso Ascoli.
Simplify your federal agency's technology procurement with Connection Public Sector Solutions. Connection's dedicated account managers, commitment to exceptional customer service, and extensive catalog of federal contracts make IT purchases quick, easy, and affordable. Turn your challenges into opportunities and get rid of your technology pain points with Connection today. Learn more about what's possible with Connection Public Sector Solutions at connection.com/fedcontracts.